Good morning. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Denise Petzold will defend the academic thesis, Archives of Change, an art conservation studies approach to innovating classical music. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Highly esteemed Prorector, members of the assessment committee, dear supervisors, family, friends, and colleagues, thank you all so much for being here today for my defense. I will take the next 15 minutes or so to tell you more about the research that I conducted over the course of the last 4 years and the main findings that I arrived at. But before I do this, let me take you to a place just a stone's throw away from here. Right around the corner of this aula, you can find the Conservatorium Maastricht, a place in which students are preparing for their musical futures. On a great day in October 2019, I visited this building for one of the case studies of my research. Before seeing the Conservatorium, you can actually hear it. There are musical snippets spilling out of open windows. You can hear sounds of trumpets, violins, and opera song float through the air. As I walk into the building, past the reception, the musical sounds get louder, sneaking out of the many practice rooms, through keyholes and under door cracks. In one of the practice rooms upstairs, I meet two people. A young cellist at the beginning of her 20s, let's call her Olivia, and a well-known cellist and performer with a lot of experience, her teacher, let's call him John. She plays a particular passage in the musical work as John interrupts her. He's not really happy with how she plays this part of the piece, and he asks her why she uses the wrong set of fingers. With this, he means that she grabs the notes on the neck of the cello, not in the way that she's expected to, but in a different way. She plays the correct notes, but she does it differently than he expects her to. And they discuss. She thinks the passage sounds better in the way that she has played it, with the fingering that she has come up with herself. And he tells her now more insistently that the way she has chosen to do it is as wrong as can be. And that he needs her to get the music right. There's some discussion and attempts to negotiate from Olivia's side before she gives in and plays the passage as he asks her to, and finally he nods satisfied. They continue to work through the piece. This is one situation I encountered many times throughout my research at the Conservatorium. Students wanting to change how a passage is being played, and their teachers asking them to stick to how the tradition dictates they should do it. Classical music, it seems, is deeply submerged in tradition. There's arguably little wiggle room for Olivia's ideas of how this piece should be played, or how this piece could be played differently. After all, Olivia is only at the beginning of her musical career, at the beginning of becoming part of this tradition. She's still learning what it entails. But why is this important? Why am I telling you this story? It's important because right now there are many discussions in Western European orchestras and conservatoires on how to innovate classical music, its practices and rituals. The reasons for that are very mixed. On the one hand, there's a long-standing narrative of declining and aging audiences. On the other hand, there are also increasingly precarious economic settings for cultural workers and other major societal challenges such as decolonization, diversification, and climate change. They all raise the question of what will happen to this tradition and musicians like Olivia, who spend years focusing and perfecting their craft. So, how to innovate, and what exactly? This question guides the work of the Maastricht Center for the Innovation of Classical Music, of which my research was part. In my project, I investigated the relation between innovation and tradition in classical music. Because what becomes clear from the example I just shared with you is that innovation always implies innovating something. In the case of Olivia, something as simple as a set of fingers shows how important tradition is and how fixed it can be, how specific, and how deeply it is ingrained in its practitioners. In my research, I propose that to meaningfully innovate classical music, we need to start from this very tradition. And to understand this tradition better, we need to look at how this music is practiced right now. So, in my book, I have studied classical music in action. I make visible how this music is practiced day in and day out by a variety of people, objects, and institutions, in order to find out how they shape and guarantee the continuing existence of this music and its tradition. My hypothesis was that by doing so, I can reveal new contexts and new opportunities for innovation, new ways to bring this music into the future that consider not only the audiences, but also its very own practitioners. And this is why, on that day in October 2019, I was sitting in the Conservatorium Maastricht to understand this tradition and what it takes to be part of it. There is another, arguably very different place in which tradition and innovation come together in the context of artistic heritage. And that's the Contemporary Art Museum, and specifically its conservation department. Here you can see Tate Modern in London. Some of you might have visited it. Ever since their emergence, museums have been busy with questions surrounding artistic heritage and its many traditions. After all, the task of a museum is to collect, conserve, and display art so that future generations can experience it. Because of this, museum professionals such as conservators frequently ask themselves what they need to do in order to bring this art into the future in meaningful ways. And they develop plenty of strategies of how to do so best in the past. And now you might wonder, why the Contemporary Art Museum? Why that kind of museum? Well, the art that these institutions collect has become increasingly performative and fleeting in the last decades. Think, for example, of performance artworks that are danced or sung. Think about installation artworks that incorporate obsolete technologies like tube TVs, or works that feature organic stuff like foodstuffs, which may decay over time. What to do with this art? How can these artworks endure? Because if we think about it, these artworks are not simply objects, they're processes. You can probably guess that the answer to these questions is not necessarily easy. Contemporary art forms challenge the well-established practices and routines in the museum, in the conservation department. So contemporary art museums are places in which ensuring the future of such innovative art has become a particularly complicated matter. Such art has focused conservators of contemporary art to substantially rethink and interrogate the ideas, the values, the practices, and the tasks of their own profession and institutions. Two main things resulted from this. The first one is that these professionals have come up with plenty of new and innovative understandings of how art exists through time. One example of these new understandings is the archive, which is a central concept in my thesis and which you may have seen also lends my book its main title. It is a concept developed by conservator and media art researcher Hanna-Barbara Hölling. Throughout my research, I used this concept to understand how classical music is conserved or kept by its practitioners. Based on this, it has also enabled me to ask how these practitioners negotiate changes in this tradition and heritage. But importantly, new understandings like the archive can also lead and have led to the development of new institutional models and practices in the museum. Based on these 2 points, so the new understandings of how art exists and how these new understandings might lead to institutional change, I was convinced that the classical music community can learn something from contemporary art conservators. I thought there was something to gain by making the question of conservation explicit in the classical music context, how to bring this art into the future, especially considering the immense drive for innovation in the field currently. And this conviction has led me to my main research question. How can approaches from contemporary art conservation assist in opening up classical music to innovation, while also helping to conserve its artistic and cultural heritage. This question has basically allowed me to look at both how classical music is conserved and kept in practice, and how it might be, based on these insights, innovated or opened up. So, how did I answer this question? Let me give you just a tiny glimpse into my case studies and my methods. What I did was that I basically investigated classical music practice in 3 distinct case studies or contexts. One of them you already got to know. The case of an instrument, the cello. For this case, I conducted observations and interviews of 3 cello classes at the Conservatorium Maastricht over the course of 1 academic year. Of course, Olivia and John were part of that. But I also observed and interviewed participants taking part in the many concerts and events of the Cello Biennale in Amsterdam in 2020. I did so to understand the role that instruments play in practicing, or better, embodying this tradition. Secondly, I did archival research into the concert programs of the London Symphony Orchestra and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. I mean those booklets that you can buy right before a concert and that tell you something about the musical works that are being performed that very night, the ensemble or the performers. I analyzed these booklets and I interviewed orchestra staff on how they are made, how they are written, and how they are circulated. And in doing so, I paid particular attention to the institutional and the organizational histories and looked at what role they play in how classical music and its tradition are brought into existence. And lastly, I analyzed the contents of 2 classical music streaming services, Adagio and Primephonic, and I looked at how this music is presented, structured, and organized on these 2 apps. I also talked to staff members of these companies to understand the strategies and the practices with which these apps are being made. And I did this in order to see how classical music and its tradition exist digitally. So I looked at these 3 cases, the cello concert programs and classical music streaming apps, as archives to understand the sets of practices, the mechanisms, the strategies that all shape how classical music and its tradition are being performed constantly, and how they do so differently in these 3 contexts. So, what did I find? Let me share maybe 2 main findings with you, and following from these findings, I would also like to share 2 concrete suggestions for practitioners and innovators of classical music, some of which might be here today. Key finding number 1. We need to understand better how, where, and by whom classical music and its tradition are practiced. This means moving outside of the performance of musical works and famous concert halls to other, maybe less visible and less obvious places and traditions that play a role in how this heritage is upheld. I'm talking about distinct national and local histories and cultures. I'm talking about past and present technological developments. I might be even talking about other musical genres, like pop music. But what does that mean for practitioners who would like to innovate? Let me make a first suggestion. It means that firstly, there is not one approach to innovating classical music, no easy solution that works across the board. Practitioners need to take into account the concrete institutional histories and cultural contexts and identities of their environments. By carefully observing and becoming aware of these, they may find concrete starting or entry points into innovation that connect to their practice and to the tradition in meaningful and specific ways. This can also help to foster an understanding of innovation that does not overwhelm orchestras and conservatoires with its radical or revolutionary connotation, but one that helps to prevent classical music innovations from becoming too obscure, too arbitrary, or even generic, and also help to secure the feasibility and relevance of these innovations. My key finding number 2. By asking the question of how to conserve classical music, and thus using the Contemporary Art Museum as a role model, the classical music community can learn more about how their art exists and how its institutions could change in order to bring this art into the future. By doing so, they might also find out more about the boundaries and contingencies of innovation. Based on this finding, my second suggestion for practitioners and innovators is to reformulate the task of innovation into one of conservation and care. Doing so may bring to light interesting and unexpected answers to questions such as what they consider important about this music, what they want to keep, and why. In a further step, that might also allow them to ask what good innovation in classical music can look like, or what it needs to do in order for this artistic heritage to continue to exist meaningfully. Of course, this is a normative and a value-loading question, but it's one that allows practitioners maybe also to take more agency in how to bring this music into the future. Let me share some last conclusive thoughts with you. And for that, let's come back to my introductory example, to Olivia and John, the two cellists at the Conservatorium Maastricht. Instead of viewing Olivia and John as opposites, let us consider that they are working towards a shared goal, the continuing existence of classical music. And to achieve this, they are both very much needed. John with his eye towards the tradition and his knowledge, but also Olivia with her ideas and her thoughts of how to do things differently. Tradition and innovation are not opposites. They're merely sides of the same coin. One cannot exist without the other. So their story is much more complex than I made it out in the beginning, and its ending is uncertain. Later, in a conversation, Olivia will tell me that she has not made up her mind yet. That despite her teacher telling her on how it should be done, and despite her giving in this very moment in the lesson, she might choose to play the piece her way in concert. Whatever she will choose to do, it will be an important moment for her, maybe for John, and for how this tradition continues. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your very nice presentation, and the opposition will now be opened by Professor René van der Waal, Emeritus Professor Art and Media at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Dear candidates, it's a great pleasure to congratulate you with your manuscript, your dissertation, which I immensely enjoyed to read. It's a very lucid exploration of the interplay of tradition and innovation of classical music through an approach that I think is very original. And not only do you focus on practices that might, by more traditional researchers, being considered derivative or secondary, and you make very clear how much these types of practices are also determinative for how classical music is transmitted and continued. And you also use a concept that has become important in conservation of contemporary art. It's your second original move, the concept of the archive, and you use it very usefully, fruitfully, to shed light on classical art traditions. So in all this, I really enjoyed reading you. The question I have is focused on this bridge between these two traditions, the theory of the archive. What you make clear is that one of the implications of the use of that concept is the insight that the work is not indefinitely open, and that its actualizations depend on a history of practices, on time. This is a rather factual observation which helps us to understand and put into perspective how highly normative practices like the performance of classical music acquire their aesthetical normativity. However, is this factual, empirical approach to this normative dimension all there is to normativity? And I would like to focus this question on the relation of archival potentiality and actualization. Is there either in Hulling's theory or your use of it, the theoretical possibility that a specific iteration of performance falls outside a work's archival potentiality? Does that notion exclude things, for instance, or prohibit things? Or is it possible that specific actualizations might be counted not merely radically different, but also mistaken or careless or wrong? Or, on a positive note, very successful? So more in general, is it necessary to allow for the possibility of incorporating a normative dimension in archival theory and research? And if so, how could this be done? Or how does the notion of the archive help you to develop your own judgments as a researcher and your recommendations? So I'm interested to your answer.
Yes, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. So let me maybe just quickly rephrase what you're asking me to reflect on. So basically your question is on the normative boundaries, in effect, of this concept, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very interesting observation that I wasn't really aware of when I was sort of exploring the concept. But I do think that the archive has a very normative dimension in a way that maybe I haven't talked enough about. You asked if works can fall outside of these ideas of archival potentiality, or then subsequently following from that also actualization. And I do think that, yes, I do think there's a possibility that works may fall outside of that. And I think my goal with using this concept was to think about, you know, how it can help me to understand the sorts of contingencies and the dependencies on which this practice, this artistic practice, relies. So in that sense, it's also different from other approaches in contemporary art conservation, where you talk about how to conserve specific artworks. And I think I'm talking about an artistic practice, in a sense. So I think that maybe I didn't push these boundaries enough in my work. And I do think that there's an important point for further reflection on how this concept can also allow you to explore, to pinpoint maybe, to make an inventory of the normativity of the values and the aesthetic ideas that are inherent to this artistic practice. And I'm talking a lot about potential, of course. And I think maybe there is further potential for how to develop this concept into something that's not only asking how a work may be kept for a future, right? How a work might be allowed to change, let's call it like that. We all know that artworks change, but to what extent we might want them to change is, of course, also an important question if we think about this artistic practice and this artistic tradition. And yes, so I do think that there's maybe more potential to that concept in that regard that I haven't explored enough.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah. Something to talk about later on.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued online by Professor Dr. Henk Borgdorf, Professor Emeritus Professor of the Theory in the Arts, Leiden University.
Dear candidates, can you hear me? Okay, let me first tell you that it was a great pleasure to read your thesis, which comprises an original and a creative approach to the question of innovation of classical music practices. In it, you approach this question from the double perspective of contemporary art conservation and science and technology studies. This is an original approach and goes beyond other current approaches that are limited to changing concert formats and enhancing audience participation. My question relates to the selection of the 3 case studies in your thesis, the concert programs, classical music streaming applications, and the relationship between a cellist and her cello. Each of these case studies is, in my opinion, well researched, and I will not go into details now. You justify the selection of case studies while they correspond to the realms of institutions, technologies, and bodies, realms through which classical music is actualized. A further justification is given by referring to the fact that the sequence of the case studies is not arbitrary. I quote you, it moves from the more tangible material forms like paper to more fleeting ones such as digital technology, and finally to the relational embodiment of a musician with their instrument, end of quote. This is all fine and well argued. But after having read your thesis, I keep wondering how the case studies were chosen. I understand how you justify the choices in retrospect, as it were, but how did you come across them? Can you give us some more insight into how that part of the research process has developed and has taken form over time? If it was not a too loaded expression, I would have asked, can you please open that part of the black box?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that question. Yes, the selection of my case studies, as you rightly pointed out, I looked at institutions, right, technologies and bodies to sort of think about how different sorts of media and different sorts of forms are involved in keeping the tradition alive. But as I understand, you're asking me to reflect on why these specifically and how I sort of came across them. And I think the first case study that I knew always that would be existent in this book is looking at how musicians learn to play an instrument. I felt that this was one of the most important parts, really, of how this tradition is kept alive and how this music is practiced and performed. So there was never really a question in my mind as to why I should not look deeper into how the relationship between musicians and their instrument takes shape over the course of a given time in their learning process. I chose the cello because I decided to start to play cello myself, to get an idea into the complexity, the difficulty that it involves in learning to play such music and such an instrument. And so this was, I think, the first case study that I always knew would be there. The other ones, so talking about the concert programs, is that I wanted to have a historical view on, or a recent historical view at least, on how this music was communicated in writing, how it was put on paper, so to say. We have an embodied dimension with the case study of the cello, but I wanted to know, how do you write about music and what kind of knowledge do you put forward in this writing? So I thought concert programs are the ideal format for that, because that's one of the most important documents, you might say, when it comes to how musical writing is being communicated and also how it reaches a wide audience, right? I could have maybe looked at music journals or musicology journals, but I wanted to see how this music is communicated to lay audiences who might not have an idea of how this music is played and who would just like to enjoy it. The two specific orchestras I chose because they had two distinct extensive archives that I could consult, and also because they cover very well two traditions in the European classical music landscape, looking at the more German, Austrian tradition, of course, with the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, and at the more British Anglophone tradition, with looking at the London Symphony Orchestra. And of course, both are also orchestras that are very old and very famous in Western Europe. So this was the reasoning behind that. And the third case, the classical music streaming, is that I wanted to understand, so the motivation behind it, the first one was to think about how music, or how classical music exists digitally, how it is put on, how it is communicated, how it is organized in a digital realm. Because classical music raises some aesthetic challenges, of course, for these technologies, and these technologies also respond to these challenges. And I chose these two, so I wanted to have a look at how this music is organized digitally, because how do you organize classical music online? I mean, we all have maybe, or some of you might have record collections at home or CDs, but once you type in a piece by Beethoven on Spotify, it'll be very difficult for you to find the piece and the rendition that you're looking for. And I wanted to have a look at how this is negotiated in music streaming apps, particularly the two apps that focus on classical music and which also try to find technological solutions to these aesthetic challenges, let's call them that. So I had used Adagio before, privately, personally, and I thought it was a very good example of, or a very interesting example maybe, of how classical music can exist online and digitally. And this is why I chose these two to also have a sort of comparative perspective.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Julia Kurzel, Professor of Musicology at the University of Amsterdam.
Dear candidate, let me begin by thanking you for giving me the pleasure to read your thesis and to congratulate you with this achievement. I would really want to mention that it is also really well written and something to devour. So, in the end, I came across something that very nicely made an arch with the beginning. You very successfully argue for an innovation that is not opposed to conservation, but as you so nicely phrase it, carefully relates the two. And then in the end, you lean on a play with words that I also really liked, the innovation and exnovation. And I thought here we have a model which into which you can feed a case, and if it kind of turns out to be a good description, then the model really works. So let me confront you with such a case. And it is, I especially delve into your third case study, the cello playing. One of the most innovative moments for me in the past few years has been the cello playing by Kate Wadsworth Bennett, who plays, for instance, the music of Brahms, leaning on the authority of the composer to introduce new fingerings, who are old fingerings, and I see you nodding, so I look forward to the discussion. So let me steer it a little bit in wanting to say that I'm not interested so much in do you need that authority to reshape the body, but instead I would like to push you into a different direction, namely when you see at what conservatories are doing, then their products are musicians. And you just said in your introduction, practitioners who want to innovate. And I found this fascinating because it left open whether innovating or to innovate is a transitive or intransitive verb. Do you innovate something? Or what do you innovate? So maybe you would like to expand on the cello playing in that sense.
Yes, thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for that question. Let me say I do think that innovation always means innovating something. And I do think you will have to have a basis for change, for innovation, for things to be done differently, right? And I think your example was actually a very nice example also of how exnovation can look like, right? It's a concept by a colleague of ours, Jessica Messman, who has written about this in the context of healthcare. And it's a concept that sort of tries to think about taking existing practices, existing knowledge as a basis for further development, for change, for innovation. And in that sense, I would say that maybe the cellist is not doing something much different than that. She is working on, of course, on the basis of a tradition. I guess that she also has a classical music background, right? She probably has gone through the education. She has learned how to perform these pieces properly, whatever that might mean. And I do think that in order for such a thing like a fingering, right, be perceived as almost something radically different, or something, in some cases, maybe also offensive, right, is something that wouldn't happen without the tradition being so strong. So I do think that there is a sort of direct link between what she has learned probably in the past, what she has internalized for decades of her career, for decades of her learning process, and that there's then a sort of desire to explore what else might be there, how else might I be able to do it, and how does that change, how does that shape the music that I'm playing, in this case Brahms, is a perfect example for, I think, how exnovation or innovation, I'm not even sure if I would like to sort of make a distinction for myself between the two, can happen. So something as simple as a fingering, as a bowing, also, of course. Yeah, I'm not sure if that has answered your question.
Yes, so doesn't that mean that the innovation is consistently put on the shoulders of the individual by the conservatory?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. It's a long way to institutional changes and to change a pedagogical system and to change an educational system that has rested on the tradition in such a firm way. And in that sense, I don't think that it's maybe any different from other practices, other educational systems that we might should change, that we might have to find new ways of teaching, new ways of exploring this music together. So there might not even be such a big difference between this educational system and other educational systems. But of course, change comes in ripples. It's not revolutionary, especially in a practice like classical music. And I think my example with Olivia has shown quite nicely maybe how it continues to change. It's not that this tradition is ultimately fixed, right? It constantly changes. People constantly make choices about it, and it might affect people like you who are listening to this music, who are listening to the music of this cellist, changing these things and perceiving it in that way. But yes, it's individual right now, and that's a pity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Vivian van Saase, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University, and the Heritage Agency of the Netherlands.
Dear candidate, congratulations on your book, which provide relevant and also for me new insights into a world that is fairly well known to me, which is conservation of contemporary art, but especially to a world that is relatively unknown to me, but to which I'm becoming increasingly familiar, thanks to the work conducted by you and also your colleagues of MCICM. I think your thesis is another exceptionally clear and well-written contribution to this growing body of literature with many compelling observations from original contexts. I was particularly intrigued, and it's probably not a surprise, by the comparison drawn between the museum as an institution and the concert hall and classical music. In your book, you repeatedly mention that the museum has changed, alongside, for example, new museum and conservation strategies developed. You also mention that classical music needs to catch up to remain relevant. Overall, the book puts quite some faith into the museum as a role model and contemporary art conservation as an impetus for institutional change. Against this understanding of the museum as an institution in flux is a growing body of institutional critique that is less optimistic about museums' ability to change, and in fact declares that the museum as an objectification machine is resistant to any substantial change. So, my question is twofolded. First, can you elaborate a little bit more about the notion of change that you upheld, and especially in the faith that you place in the museum as a role model? And second, I would like to learn a little bit more about how you envision the proposed innovations that you well, that you propose based on the analysis of your three contexts, to potentially impact the institutional practices of classical music, especially when situated in the concert hall. So what does this process of change or innovation look like? Are you perhaps proposing change that is more of a kind of organizational subunit proliferation, and indeed slow and incremental adjustments to establish practices and procedures? So what does this change look like?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. That's a very good point, I think, the institutional critique about if museums are really capable of true change, and maybe also to what extent, and I sense this a little bit in the question, we should look to the museum to basically turn to classical music. And of course, it's not all honey and butterflies, I guess. So the intention of using contemporary art conservation as a sort of building block of my thesis was that there is a lot of open discussion on this, right? There's a lot of material on this, as you also say. There's a lot of literature on institutional critique, on what maybe not go so well, where the problems may be. But I'm not saying that we can't learn from the problems too. So we might also learn from the crises, from the problems, from the conflicts that this institution is undergoing at this point of time. And of course, there's a lot of issues about decolonization, about returning artistic heritage to the places of their origin, which makes it a very topical issue, I think. And there's, of course, also underlying this, a little bit of this moves also, I think, into classical music and the question of what works we should still play in that sense. So I'm not saying that we should put all our faith, all our trust in the museum. I think I'm making a humble proposition to consider that there are other institutions, maybe not even the museum, maybe it could also be something else, to think about, how to bring classical music into the future. But I think a good case for contemporary art conservations and museums as institutions is that there has been this open dialogue, that there has been this critical reflection that's ongoing, even if we don't know what will happen with it, right, at this point of time. There's little talk, arguably, about this if you go to a rehearsal space, and there are no people talking about, if we should still play X or Y. But so I do think let's not put all our trust, let's not put all the responsibility also on this institution, on the museum, to induce change in classical music. It's more a proposition to look outside of the immediate artistic practice that these people are immersed in for decades. And there's little sort of room to go outside of that. And this is, I think, what I'm trying to do. And then, of course, the second part of the question was, how does this change look like, right? So also looking at my recommendations, what kind of change am I talking about? I do think that at many points, my recommendations are optimistic. They are written or thought about in an optimistic manner. It might be difficult to implement all the things, right? It might be difficult to make them a practical reality for many of the practitioners who are participating in this artistic practice day in and day out. But I do think change goes slowly, and sometimes even a small change can go a long way. And this can happen on different levels. It can happen on an individual level, as we've seen, I think, with the question about the cellist. It can happen on an institutional level, about new policies, new subjects to teach, for example, at the Conservatoire, who are also right now, the Conservatoire Maastricht, in the middle of sort of trying to reformulate, re-articulate their curriculum. And I think there's different levels. And while it might be small, I don't think that means that it can't go a long way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Daryl Cressman, Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, congratulations on writing a very good book. Balancing rigorous scholarship with elegant prose is a difficult challenge, but you did it quite well. Your contributions to theorizing the relationship between tradition and change within classical musical culture are also very impressive. This is a challenging relationship because tradition seems to be the essence of this culture, such that it is the thing that people often identify, cherish, or critique about classical musical culture. Because of the role of tradition, you identify the potential for change not with the concert event, but from the numerous archives that make up classical musical culture, and in particular, institutions, technologies, and bodies. This approach, I think, is well suited to a tradition-bound musical culture because it is both expansive in its scope while also accounting for those aspects of the culture that seem stable and more impervious to change. And this leads to my question. As you move from the concert event and all that this entails to the, as you write, sometimes neglected everyday practices that make up the extensive realm of classical music culture, does the scope of archival potential also expand as we move outwards from the concert event? Or to put it differently, does archival potential reside in the work and its performance in the same way that it does in concert programs, conservatories, and technologies?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, esteemed opponent, for that question. So it's a question about scope of archival potentiality, of if it moves outwards of the artistic practices that are observed towards the very works that we play in a concert hall, if I understand correctly. Okay. I do think, of course, the concept is not a new concept, right? So even in contemporary art conservation, it's not new. But of course, it's much older. It starts with Derrida and Foucault. It's a very loaded concept as well, with a lot of history that has been sort of taken up into the contemporary art conservation context not a little while ago. And of course, there it was used, or Hölling used it to think about particular works, right? Particular installation artworks. She talks about Namjoon Paik in her book quite a bit, which she uses to lay out this concept and to develop it further. And so I do think it pertains also to the musical works, especially the idea of archival potentiality could be an important and interesting one. But of course, it's a different case, right? Because classical music works do not exist in the same way as an installation artwork does. Installation artworks are stored, they're kept somewhere, they're rebuilt, materials are replaced. And then the question, of course, is how is that still the same work? In classical music, we don't have that question that much, right? We perform a musical work, we perform it according to the score, and then we can recognize that it is Beethoven's Fifth, for example. But of course, that gives us the idea to talk about the kind of, well, I don't want to say authenticity, but the kind of I'm missing the word, the kind of skill with which that work is performed, right? The kind of mark that it hits in a way. So I do think that it could be an interesting concept to explore what could be part of musical works. I do think it would work very differently in that respect. I think it's interesting to think about how, if we talk about innovations in the concert hall, a lot of things are happening, right? Orchestras play in factories, they play in different places, they have nice visuals in the back, right? Huge projections with some sort of visual artworks that are meant to accompany the music and to do something to the experience of the listeners. And I do think for that, this concept could be interesting because we could ask with it, is this becoming part of this music? Is this something that is still extraneous to the performance of the music? Do we need the fancy screens and the fancy visuals? Do we maybe want to make them part of this work? And what would that entail? What would that mean? So I do think there's an interesting question to ask how this concept also would change in the case of classical music, but it's a question well worth asking, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We now have time for a second round, and the opposition will be continued by our invited guests. So I turn again online to Professor Dr. Henk Borgdorf.
Thank you. My second question relates to what you say about interdisciplinarity. In that context, you refer, among others, to Georgina Born, Andrew Barry, and Kisa Viskalinis, who wrote a seminal article on what they call the logics of interdisciplinarity. In their work, they distinguish, as you know, between three logic: the logic of accountability, the logic of innovation, and the logic of ontology. I read your work, above all, as a nuanced contribution to the innovation of classical music, as the subtitle of your thesis indicates. But you also claim that your interdisciplinary work has an ontological bearing. You write on page 249, I quote, "I hope that my approach would stimulate new insights into how artworks of a particular artistic practice or tradition may exist over time, responding and contributing to this epistemological and ontological layer of interdisciplinarity." End of quote. Could you please convince me that I've misunderstood your work as confined to the logic of innovation, and elaborate a little bit on the ontological and maybe also the epistemological meaning of your research?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. So if I understand correctly, you're asking me to reflect on the logic of ontology in relation to my demands to the book, or I'm not sure if I understood correctly.
Well, you refer to the work of Georgina Born and the others, and you also positively underline the epistemological and ontological bearing of your work. Well, if I read your thesis, I think the main drift and also the subtitle of your work refers to that, is about innovation in classical music, in relation to conservation, of course, and care, and that's all very interesting, but I don't get the ontological part yet. So maybe I misunderstood your work, and I ask you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, thank you. Now I understood it. Thanks. So the question is, so talking about the logic of ontology and how my work specifically relates to that, instead of maybe talking about innovation. Now I got it. Yes, I think, so my motivation was that, I mean, if Born and Barry talk about these three logics, right, there is a sort of normative dimension to them, in the sense that, of course, we talk about the logics of accountability, of innovation, and then also, of course, of ontology. And ontology seems to be the one that's most worthwhile almost to attend to. I think I cannot speak myself free of this. And I think I ideally, of course, would like my work to be a contribution to this third strand, to think about, okay, maybe my theoretical approach is opening up ideas of how artworks can exist through time, of how classical music practitioners may understand change, how they may understand tradition and the relation between change and tradition. And of course, the logics of innovation can play an important part in that, I think. Also accountability, of course. I think these are things that are not easily dismissed. But in terms of epistemological and ontological reflection, I think it is specifically my approach and my bringing together theoretical work from a different field, from a different area of both theoretical but also practical study, right? And this is something that I also highlight in the book, is that art conservation, and particularly contemporary art conservation, is both practical and theoretical. And this is something that I find highly relevant in the case of classical music. Of course, ideally, we would like to be theory and practice to be more connected, right? We would like to have practitioners maybe think about how work exists through time. Practically, that's not always feasible, and I realize that. But I think there's something worthwhile looking at ontology, or at the ontology of artistic practice, of artworks, that contemporary art conservation has, that brings together theory and practice, that shows that these theoretical insights do not merely have to remain theoretical. And this is something, I think, to learn in classical music. And this maybe goes a little bit deeper into the logic of ontology or epistemology that you were asking about. That, for example, new musicology or music sociology, art sociology, is theoretically very far away from the reality that happens in concert halls, in orchestra rehearsals, in practice rooms of the conservatoire every day. And if we can find more ways of reflection in that sense, and this is, I think, the contribution that I also would like to make, is to show that in this artistic practice can also mean theory, maybe. Yeah. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Enough. Thank you.
Then we have time for a second round question by Professor Dr. Julia Kursell.
Yeah, I'm really happy I have this occasion to utter a second question mark, and I would pose it to your stelling, your proposition number 5. You introduced performance art as one of your inspirations. We've now gone through a trajectory with you about how there is a kind of play between objectifying or not objectifying music and performance. And you do give recommendations in your 9th chapter for what should museums do and learn from your work. And I would want you to add some more recommendations for how should museums deal with performance art.
Yes, thank you. So proposition number 5.
That is the one, proposition number 5, or just my question.
Yes.
You don't need to refer to.
Okay.
That is the one where you say they need to maintain a dialogue among a range of artistic forms and practices, such as music, because this is where the field draws its innovative and epistemological potential form.
Yes.
And this is about the growing establishment of art forms like performance art or time-based art, media art. I would like to, in particular, you to focus on performance art.
Yes, thank you so much. So adding a few recommendations, right? Adding maybe a few thoughts to that proposition and to think about what else that could mean, or what else I could say to museum professionals, whom I certainly meet in the hallway later, so yeah. I think one recommendation or one remark I would maybe make is that conservators of performance art do not only look at a work, right? They not only look at a musical work or at a musical work, at a performance artwork, but these performance artworks, they are often, of course, also practices by certain artists. So if you think about, I don't know, let's take the first thing that comes to my mind, Marina Abramovic, for example, right? This is a performative practice, almost, I would say. And I think something to learn from the classical music context is that conservators do not only maybe look at works, they do not only look at artworks, but they're also considering how an artistic practice develops, how it looks like, and what to do with that artistic practice in the future. Maybe, for example, if the artist is not there anymore, which of course makes the work more complicated, right? It makes the task of conservation more complicated. But there is also in these performance artworks, there often is a tradition, and there often is a sort of development almost. And I think that this is something to learn, maybe in a sense, also from classical music. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring defense. Denise Petzold, the time appointed for your defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Denise Petzold, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Peters is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor. Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Denise Petzold, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate, signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Denise, congratulations with your PhD and with a very well written and researched book that no doubt will find its way both in the world of academia and the world of classical music. And congratulations, of course, also on behalf of Karin. We both got to know you as a student in the Research Master cast after you graduated in the BA Arts and Culture at VASOS. During a course on recreating musical cultures of the past that I taught with Daryl, you wrote a paper on the history of the orchestra pit in opera houses. And during a visit to the Düsseldorf Opera, you were intrigued by the musicians in the pit rather than the singers and stories on the stage. And I very much liked the title of your paper, Big Stories in Small Spaces. It showed your keen eye for detail in your material and also your elegant style of writing. In your research master's thesis, you turned to the world of contemporary art, more specifically the dilemmas and challenges museum practitioners face when it comes to conserving these works. You focused on performance artworks. Their ephemeral character is a problem for the museum. What is it you acquire when you acquire a performance artwork? In your thesis, you presented your material in rich detail as intriguing stories, precious archival traces, photographs, and insightful observations that testified of the everyday practice of museum professionals. And I still remember this wonderful example of the blackboards that Joseph Beuys used during a lecture in the early 1970s. As documentation of his performance, they were later exhibited as artworks themselves. And you explored this intriguing puzzle of where the work of art ends and the documentation of the work begins, not only in empirical detail, but also in a very thorough theoretical analysis. And for your thesis, by the way, you won the Student Award 2016 of Maastricht University. After you graduated, you did not pursue an academic career immediately, but instead you worked as a curator at the International Art Museum Ludwig Forum in Aachen. And we kept in touch, happily so, Because when the Maastricht Center for the Innovation of Classical Music started in 2018, we were lucky to have you as one of the 2 PhD researchers. Your previous work on the ontologies of contemporary time-based artworks proved to be a very fruitful basis for studying the handing down of musical works. Or to put it differently, the practices that focus on keeping them alive, adding to their trajectories. The conceptual work that you started in your MA thesis and continued in your dissertation has been crucial to the research in the MCICM. But more importantly, you were also a wonderful member of our team, always interested in and supportive of the work of the others. Reading, thinking along, generous in your help and comments, and coloring our work as a center with your personal perspective on it. You entered the world of classical music in many ways, and we have heard about that by reading program notes, analyzing streaming apps, and also by following cello students and their teachers at the Conservatory Maastricht and the Cello Biennale. By the time you were doing your fieldwork, the pandemic started. It affected you not only as a researcher, but also personally, as you had to work from home, sometimes feeling isolated. I admire your strength and the resilience with which you bounced back when times were difficult. Dear Denise, supervising you has been a real pleasure. And I also speak, you can see that, on behalf of Karin, that we always looked forward to our meetings. In my case, because I knew that I would learn new things from you. Learning new things is also what you did when you decided to play the cello early on in your project. You told us enthusiastic stories about your lessons, about how difficult it was to choose between 2 cellos. And in the end, you bought a 3rd. I think it shows how thoughtful you are, taking things very seriously, but always in for making fun. Talking about lessons, you are also a very talented teacher yourself, as your students at Fasels will agree. At the end of your thesis, you write about the importance of interdisciplinarity. In your case, between the work of classical music and that of contemporary art. Both can learn from each other, and after you entered both worlds, you have had many ideas about how it can work. Crossing boundaries, crossing disciplinary boundaries is not easy. Admit it, as a student at our faculty, you were taught why it is so important. But to be a good traveler between worlds, you need what Karin and Aagje Swinnen, in their recent edited volume on interdisciplinarity, have aptly called curated curiosity, as well as the ambition to collaborate. You have both. But for you, I would like to add the C of courage, the courage to go on when the work to be done is hard. But for now, Denise, let's celebrate that the work is done, together with you and your family, friends, and colleagues.
Dear Dr. Petzold, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. Congratulations. Let's clap again. We will now celebrate the young doctor in the Refter, i.e. in the courtyard, so I ask the audience to already go outside. We will still take a picture with Dr. Petzold in here and then on the stairs, and there's also the possibility for Professor Borgdorf to exchange a few words with Denise, and then we just enjoy the day. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.